Hello, this is UkrLife TV. We're continuing our casts, and we're glad to see Olexiy Arestovich today. Hello, Olexiy, glad to see you. Hello. We met before this war started, and we were collectively very unhappy with the position of the West. You and a bunch of other politicians, and I also supported you guys in that view. So now, 2 months after this war started, a couple important things happened. First is that the head of Pentagon is meeting with allies on the American base Ramstein in Germany to discuss helping Ukraine to not let Russia restore its power. And second was the visit of the General Secretary of the United Nations to Moscow and then to Kiev. So, after the first 2 months have passed, how much have changed if we compare with the times before the war? All right. Let's see, what do people usually do not understand? Now they're talking about mistakes that were made before the beginning of war. Among them, there were souls that are simple on purpose. They make big eyes and say that we should have listened to the West back in December, that the attack is inevitable, and are eager to start showing where Ukraine would be attacked from 4 directions. So, do you know what Ukraine was asking? Ukraine was asking to give us weapons preemptively and start sanctions preemptively. Perhaps they would not be Mariupol and would not be Bucha in this case. And when I'm saying that, it's not from the point of view that the West is bad. I'm just saying it's worse than a crime. It's a mistake, citing Tolerine. West made some mistakes that cost us blood, heavy mistakes. And at the same time, I have no qualms with the West. I'll explain why, because in the world history, everybody keeps repeating the same mistake many, many times. Even if we take our favorite example, Israel, in the world history, when the war was about to start, there may be 2 or 3 cases throughout the entire history when the country actually believed that the war will start. One of them is the War of 67, when Israel started by preemptively striking Syrian and Arabs' positions. The same people, highlight, same people, 6 years later in 73, having the full intel and map, because one of the Israeli double agents was serving on the top of Egypt military, did not believe his data and refused to do preemptive strike, and got the war that elder Israelis who are still alive after that war, their hands were shaking. I was talking to them when they were describing. They were saying that they thought it's a catastrophe. They lost about 2,600 dead out of 3 million, so about almost 1%, 3,000 from 3 million. So every 1,000, they lost 1 out of 1,000. If we count that in Ukraine in a month, that would be 460,000 loss in 1 month in Ukraine. That was a complete disaster. There was even an order to attach nuclear bombs, which they officially did not have, under their bombers to try to start bombing the advancing troops. Egypt tanks reached the heights and was just about to roam straight to the capital. And Israeli jet fighters tried to attack Egypt aircraft missiles, and they lost about 160 pilots in a few days. and even the very experienced pilots from Israel refused to partake in that, or were starting to get cold feet. And Golda Meir actually retired after that war, who was, by the way, from Kiev originally. And I've seen these wars, how they started. Since '99, I was in intel, military intel, so I've seen how they start before they actually start. So it's an interesting way to see that.
Когда самолеты взлетели, они уже в воздухе. Вот они уже приближаются, например, к иракской границе. Мы это все видим, мы это все знаем.
So when we actually saw the airplanes, Russian jets getting up and trying to go and bomb, just 5 minutes before they start dropping bombs, colonels who fought several wars were in disbelief about that. Somebody dug my video from 2019 when I was telling how it will happen and when it will happen, pretty accurately, and there are colonels who are refusing to believe it when it's happening. And it's hard to blame people about that. It's a very common mistake. And West is interesting in this regard. They did win over Soviet Union in the Cold War, and they won mostly because of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. Reagan said a pretty simple way, it's an empire of evil, we gotta finish them. And then Francis Fukuyama announced the end of history. And if it is an end of history, then the West doesn't need historic figures. So they kind of disappeared as brand. Out of historic figures, there's maybe Boris Johnson right now, and even mostly because he really is a history buff and he studies Churchill and he tries to mimic him in some things. So, in Europe they might care about having fresh croissants near Coliseum on the square somewhere and good coffee. And in America they probably care more about economy and the rights of ancestors of slaves. Now, these countries had to follow a dangerous evolution in the last 2 months, from 0 to 60 in 60 days. So the West, together with us, did a huge jump in these 2 months. They hit the historic concepts, smacked their face straight in them, and apparently history did not disappear. It did not stop happening. So now when they see Bucha and Mariupol citizens dead and kids orphaned, and these pictures populate the TV, news about mass rapes and murder, and we got confirmations. So most people are just horrified out there. So, and they're starting to make decisions. So when people are saying that Russians take long to settle but write fast, it's not about Russians, it's about Americans. Americans do that. And I'll remember Churchill's words that Americans usually make a right decision after trying all the wrong ones. So I think they are getting to the point of making that right decision. I actually am a bit optimistic because at the beginning of war I was not sure that even events like Bucha would help them. And now even guys like Germany start to scream that we need to support Ukraine after initial support of 5,000 helmets and the words, not everything is so simple. But again, it's politics. If it was opposition in Germany in power, they'd be saying the same thing, and it's easier to scream things when you're in opposition. But anyway, right now there are about 50 countries gathering in Ramstein, and they're deciding how to help Ukraine win the war. One of the main key phrases is that Putin must go and Russia must be won over in this war.
Позвольте, я сейчас вас перерву ненадолго, потому что то, что вы сейчас говорите, очень созвучно со статьей известного британского исследователя.
So I want to refer to what James Sher said. You probably know him. He's a security expert. And he said that one has to seriously separate the defeat and the punishment of Russia, and victory and such. Let's address if the West is unified in the vision of Ukraine winning over Russia, and let's also address what does victory mean for Ukraine. It's even said that we will not sign peace accords on Putin's terms. Even Stolz, who one would never think would say anything like that. The one who was wiggling about what to supply, what not to supply, but that's what he said recently. There is one more thing I think West needs to make, which it hasn't so far. They need to acknowledge that they help Putin grow. Putin is their creation. And that's when I'll start respecting West fully. Because for now I respect them halfway. Because they helped this monster grow. They helped this monster to get his equipment. Because we capture their equipment, the Russian stuff, and they get a lot of components made from imported parts. Like we get the protection system, Panzer. A lot of components are made from German parts, or aiming systems on their armored vehicles are supplied by French companies. And conservative side of the West was looking at Putin as the example of the strong national leader. And they're trying to play baby supporting Russia versus China, forgetting that what Reagan said, that such a regime is a pure evil, and Putin is such a regime. The only radical support that we appreciated fully came from Johnson, who said that we gave Ukraine 3 days and they actually it's been 2 months and they're still holding, so we'll hold them. Similar statements were made by Blinken and Austin. And they're talking about the military victory of Ukraine. And that's what... That's what Zelensky was saying, that Ukraine needs to win, and now finally the West, the wise West, also figured that they need to follow the military victory of Ukraine. And the strategy is simple. They need to supply Ukraine with weapons. Russia has no sources to get resupplies. They're bringing some from Iran and some from China. One needs to clarify the detail, but I think Russia doesn't have factories to restock Grad and Hurricane systems, so they're trying to pull these outdated rockets from the countries that are sanctioned. And there was a little bit of intel that China was also supporting some things. In the Western media, there were leaks about that. But I don't think they supplied weapons. I think they supplied spare parts and such. And it appears that China was told. So they're not doing that actively. The war will soon transition to the positional fighting. Russia is losing their last resources and they need to hold their positions they captured and try to defend them. And that'll be a time for us to switch to advancing maneuvers. And we'll need to, do the usual cut, surrender, make sure they leave, recapture the territories, and we can probably get Lugansk and Donetsk back. As for Crimea, I'm not sure. I'm suspecting they might try to defend it with nuclear weapons, because it's sort of a sacred story for them. As for the rest, it depends upon the armaments and weapons that both sides will have, and quantities thereof, so we'll see what will be the result of that Ramstein meeting, because it's not really a problem for us to kick Russians' ass here. There could be a different variant of events here, that we kick their butts back to the line of 23rd of February, discuss in the negotiations. We might escalate the future destiny of Donetsk, Lugansk, and Crimea on the international arena. And remember how Russians were saying proudly before the war that Crimea to be discussed. Now they're saying, like fluffy bunnies, that Ukraine can be decided 15 years later. Crimea and question can be deferred by 15 years. And one realized that they may hope that somebody may die in the meantime. And I don't think historical time frame is big of a deal here, because, you know, German Democratic Republic lived for what, 50 years, separated from the other side of Germany. So DNR and LNR will still be separate. We'll get them sooner or later. And right now we're in a chase who gets there faster. Either Russian side gets more troops to the border, or we manage to get more weapons and more conscripts to push them back. Alexei, I remember when we were discussing the war in Nagorno-Karabakh, Armenia, Azerbaijan, I had people referring from the experts who were talking about the story were referring to you, saying that you have a deep understanding of the military aspect of this war. So let's, if you don't mind, look at this war that's happening for 2 months, maybe as a distanced military expert, a bit detached from these events. I understand it may be difficult, but still. If we follow this style of military actions, for example, traditionally Russia does not have a military reserve. Why? Is it because their economy was not transitioned? And how did that occur? Or how did we survive in general? Because I did watch your interview with Mark yesterday, and you were remembering the initial few days, how difficult it was when there were some planes and airborne troopers landing in Gostomel, and our forces were kicking them out. So globally, how did that happen where we are now? Maybe try to do a distanced overview. Yeah, let's remember that I'm not a military expert, I'm here as an observer. So I'm observing. So everything started probably at the stage of military construction. Putin gave a task back in about 2008 to create military forces that can fight NATO on par, equally. After the war in Georgia, yes, it was after the war in Georgia. So, in 2007, he got notes that Ukraine is not being taken into NATO, and he got the understanding that Ukraine will not be part of NATO, so he started thinking how to do that, how to capture Ukraine. So you cannot really fight NATO on par if you have Ukraine, which is not subdued. So they made conclusions out of the war in Georgia. They put Serdikov as the head of the Russian army, who many people blamed and different things, but he actually did a lot for Russian army. And their conclusion was interesting. They understood that they cannot match the force of the USSR army, because you need to spend insane amount of money. Quantity, quality, production capabilities. Ural Vagonzavod, the tank factory in Russia, makes 60 tank stops right now. And Soviet Union could make about 12,000 of tanks a year, and without even sweating it. So they realize they'll never be able to repeat that. But they need to create an army that can they can work strategic operations. I'd remind you that strategic are the ones that when you capture the country, tactical, operative is when you capture regions, and tactical are local fights. So strategic are full countries capture, Ukraine, Baltic countries, and they started building armies. They created 10 field armies. But here is a caveat that Soviet armies they had 5 to 6 divisions per army. How many people? There was about 80. They were all somewhat different. Each division was different, so depending upon their functions, they were equipped differently. But the army was from 80 to 120,000 people when it was fully staffed, because there were other kinds of armies. So the 40th Army in Afghanistan, the Soviet Union, had about 115,000 people. To compare, the group of Soviet troops was 5 armies and 450,000 troops back when Germany was separated. So they still create armies now, but instead of 5 or 6 divisions, it's only 2 division armies. It does sound scary that they got 10 armies, but inside it's only 2 divisions in each of them. Also, in the Soviet divisions, each division had 5 groups underneath it. And there would be a tank detachment, anti-air. Over that would be flying an air army, protecting several field armies, and that's how they were fighting. And ahead of them, there were special forces and airborne troopers, and they were communicating, disrupting comm lines, and spreading shock and awe. That was back in the 40s, 60s. So back during the Second World War, Zhukov gathered a bunch of soldiers on the motorbikes and told them, hey, you guys advance. That was an example for reference. And he basically said, you just drive your bikes as fast as far as you can. And the ones who sustain the tempo, 100 kilometers per day for 2 days, you get a hero of Soviet Union just for that. You don't even need to engage enemy. You need to create shock and awe. And there were troops like that in the Soviet army. They played a pretty serious role for disrupting and demoralizing Germans at that war. So Russian airborne troops became that kind of shock and awe. They throw forces in the back of the enemy defense, and then big heavy armor goes and follows and attacks the confused enemy lines. So Russian divisions used to be 5 or 6 detachments based. Modern Russian divisions are 2, maybe 3 detachments based. So I don't know if Putin did not understand that or did not dig deeper, but yeah, they're literally about a half of what they used to be in Soviet Union. So if we go back to 2014, when Russian troops got to Ilovaisk and were fighting our troops there, which were ragtag at that point of history, they couldn't even break through in Ilovaisk. We stopped them there. That was the spot that even Russian army could not advance. So if they could advance, they would not sign a peace treaty. So military results stopped. They need to somehow fix it on paper. So that's what they did. That's when they signed the peace treaty. So after that war and approaching this new one, they started building armies right on the border with our territory. So they put about 4 armies on the border with Ukraine, and they kept training all the time. There is summer and winter training, so we were kind of getting used to Russian troops marching and doing things on the border. So at the same time, we're also training ourselves and preparing ourselves for a sudden attack and reinforcing our positions. So They created these armies and they said, oh, look, we have a 220,000 group of troops, and if we send them to Ukraine, they'll get there and they'll shock and annoy everybody and we'll capture everything. So how did that how was that group created? They brought 8 armies to the border of Ukraine out of 10, and they threw them in. And then later they threw in the other 2. So there's no Kurils and Sakhalin. There's barely anybody left. So if 2 lonesome samurais want to go, or Mujahideen want to go to Moscow, they can easily do that. So they brought in 8 armies, and then they brought 2 more later. The longest to enter was 5th Army East. Why? Because it's the least prepared. And they all came here eventually. And they brought all 500 airplanes that they have that are flying. I think 380 or so of them are really flying. The rest are spare parts and stuff. And they brought their missile systems, Iskanders, even to Belarus to attack from there. And they started. And they reported back that they're ready to advance. At the beginning of it, we had 350,000 people defending Ukraine. 50,000 guards, 50,000 border guards, about 160 police, also people who can hold weapons. So Russians attack with 200,000. Almost a 500,000 group, if you count all the different, 400,000 group, that can push back. That is a really weird way to wage wars. But they're not idiots. Yeah, Ludmila, they're idiots. I'm observing their actions now, but they're idiots. I was looking for different ways to describe how they fight. They're idiots. I am observing the events and how they do it. It's really idiotic. Let me bring some examples. So, what was the perspective of such an operation? They did not have it. They could not solve the tasks with the troops they had at hand. Soviet Union to recapture Ukraine back in the Second World War created 4 Ukraine fronts, 2.5 million people. Barely, with bloody fighting, they managed to do that. And now Russia, with what, 200,000 people, wants to take Ukraine? And in Chechnya they had 4 times bigger group, which is much smaller than Ukraine. Ukraine has a territory bigger than France, still haven't lost the central command of their troops. One has to be an idiot to even attempt such an operation. For all that, General Beseda in Russia is paying his price. We hear that he is in prison, being interrogated in Lefortovo. That's an FSB prison. So a closer circle of Putin, Naryshkin, Bortnikov, and Shoigu were making decision. That was the only head of department that was always participating, Besedin. So the others, except for Shoigu, really didn't have anything to do in that group. So this guy had a separate department of FSB working with a separate region of Ukraine. Imagine that at the beginning of the conflict with Ukraine, they had about 10,000 clerks running different analysts running all the data on the Ukraine. 10,000 people in Putin's troops were working, so to say, preparing for the invasion of Ukraine. There was a budget for them. A bunch of them were just bloggers, and it's interesting how the money was sent. But
и средствах, вернее, в силах информационной борьбы против Украины, это штатные, это не считая нештатных, купленных блогеров и так далее. Все это масса занималась. На них выделили 5 миллионов.
9,000 people were sitting in the means of informational warfare with Ukraine, not including bloggers and stuff. They spent about $5 billion during these years on this department. So what does the Russian line of command represent itself? The main issue that authoritarian regimes fail over is the reality, connection with reality, because it's not president who is ruling things, it's his referent who is running things, because he's looking at the folders prepared by these referents. And Putin is scared to even look on the internet, but up until today he was very rational. He is making rational decisions, even including today's date. He's got only one error, one mistake. He's in a fake reality. And that's why it's a scary and bad decision to use propaganda and authoritarian system. Because if you push an idea, let's attack Ukraine and do this and this and kick their butts, and then somebody will raise his hand and say, by the way, they have aviation, artillery, West may support them. In Putin's regime, he would be looked at and kicked out of the meeting, because you should not be going against the flow. And that's how you lose all the smart ones. And then the only ones left are the ones who created that perverted view of the world and who is earning and making money of that view of the world. And lie needs to go on, because you need to cover previous lies with new lies. And they essentially lied for $5 billion, and I think that's a minimum amount. So Putin's idea was that the army goes into Ukraine, being greeted and warmly welcomed, and all the Ukrainian troops change sides, and there may be a few nationalists left who need some ass-kicking at the end, but the paradox is that in Russia they're saying that resistance is organized by separate nationalistic battalions, and that's not a joke. That's how they saw things in Ukraine when they were joining. They thought they'll be greeted with flowers and then they'll surround the nationalists and destroy them. I remember Putin turning to Ukraine, saying that to Ukrainian military, telling them to give up and put down the weapons and fighting, and everything will be alright. And that's what part of their plan. They wanted to do shock and awe and break the central command, and I can say that they almost succeeded that. And I want to repeat that it's emotional memory is important here, and I tried to convey the emotion of the first 2-3 days. I'm sitting there and I'm looking at my cell and getting notes, a column of 300 units, 250 units, 400 units. I'm starting to calculate as a military man, knowing the forces that protect Kyiv. I'm not even talking about Kharkiv and other places. I was getting data from there too, but I was just thinking about Kyiv. And then I look over my shoulder to a friend saying, hey, so where are the grenade launchers? And how do we get them fast? Because I was thinking that that'll end up in this. I was thinking that if they started at 4 in the morning, probably by noon or by 2 p.m., we'll be fighting next to our building. Because there is no way to hold such a wave. We could be triple times over brave, but there is just technically impossible to hold such a group of attackers. I quickly talked to friends, so we prepared some caches around the city so we could do guerrilla fighting here and there. And since President said we're not abandoning office, so the last battle will be here in the president's office, and I only had 2 options from here. I either will be killed defending it, or maybe I'll have a chance to flee after the fight and go into guerrilla warfare fighting style here in Kyiv. And I was literally creating caches, where to pick food, where to pick ammo, where to pick weapons, where can we stay and sleep. So that's what we were pre-coordinating in those few hours. And I'm looking at that. And I'm reading, the moment I kind of get a breather that we got some things under control, I'm getting another notice that there's another 1,500 units advancing towards Kyiv. We just couldn't, because our ratio was maybe 1 to 15. And then they had, I see more Russian troops getting to Obolon. There's a push to Beresteyska when the 101st Brigade was stopping the saboteurs. And in the office, they usually don't talk about that, but we were shot at least 4 times. On the second day, there was some good fighting when the Russian special forces got to the office and were standing by the windows shooting back. And every day, our security forces are finding more mines and more traps and more things. There are more saboteurs trying to get to our president. A lot of them are captured, but there are still more around. You heard about the car with 500 kilos of explosives? You know, that's a scary story. By the way, when do you think it happened? Oh, it actually was here 2 weeks ago. After Russian troops withdrew from Kiev, and the Kiev is relatively free. So they're still working. Oh yeah, they're still working. There are very serious people still trying to get to the president in his office. Not many people are talking about it, or none at all, except for, who else, Arestovich. So in those first days, that was a really surreal situation. So we had airborne troopers in Gostomel, and then in the Veselkovo, the other airfield where they were supposed to land and continue advancing. So one of the groups was sent to Gostomel instead of Veselkov, because we were fighting Gostomel heavily and they were sent there to reinforce. So they threw the second wave there, and then they had more ground troops that were supposed to meet with them near Gostomel. And on the first day, when the journalists were here, were giving them a briefing, I was pushing them, ushering them out of the building, and they were asking questions. So, why are you kicking us? And in my calculations, there was maybe 1 hour left before Russians will be here. And they're asking, hey, why are you pushing us out? Like, hey guys, you can stay. I'll even give you machine guns, because we could use every able-bodied man. It did look as the end, because we had nobody on Pecherska to hold the Russian troops. And everybody turned to the president and said, so what are we doing? And he says, no, there is not an option, we're staying here and fighting. And just left for his office. So that story was fighting interestingly. On the technical side, it was impossible to hold them, but we somehow did. So answering the question, who won the war, I think Zelensky won it. I know the critics will be screaming at me, but I think he won it when he said we're not retreating. There shouldn't be screaming. It was important. It was psychologically very important. I remember it myself. Yeah, he said we're not retreating, we're staying here. He kept the centralized management, central control of the troops, and also the guys on the ground won. And they won because of 3 very simple reasons. First, they had no picture. They did not know there's 1,200 units rolling towards them. They see idiots on 3 Tigers approaching, so they burned them with grenade launchers and said, hey, that's a cool grenade launcher, they said. Second factor is that Ukrainian self-organization, which has a lot of good qualities and bad qualities, here the good ones reveal themselves, who basically said, who cares about Central Command? We got grenade launchers, so we can fight, and they were fighting. And the third factor was that the middle and even higher level of military command retained the high level of management. I saw many of them, most of them, at the beginning of the conflict. And it was not too easy to observe them, because there were a bunch of the higher military ranks who were running around screaming that Russians will be sending orders to fight from western Ukraine. And it was funny, some of them went there, refused to come back, so we had to utilize them from the western Ukraine and basically assign them to something there so they could manage stuff and still partake and help us. Also, on the hottest directions, there was Special Forces of Military Intelligence. That's my 72nd Brigade. Those are prepared guys, right? Yeah, those are the experts. Those are the ones who stopped Russians in Bucha and the like, and who gave the first fight near Lutish. Their ratio was usually 1 to 15 versus Russians. And they split them and put them in different places, and a bunch of different battalions joined them, like Azov, not the main backbone of Azov, but Azov joined them, policemen with machine guns, both here and in Nikolaev, border guards, everybody who could. But the first significant fight was by Special Forces of Military Intelligence. So, first of all, they know the tactics, and then they also took some initiative and went forward to meet Russians in certain spots. Second, they blew up most of the bridges. And it was military intel, there was artillery, and it was very well coordinated effort. And that's Kyiv. Why Chernihiv was never taken? It was not taken because of the ancestors in the 13th century picked the spot, because that city is connected by a network of little rivers, and it's really difficult to cross them, because even the small river represents a barrier for the military force, if it's deep enough. So here in Kyiv, there's another interesting thing. Many people were saying that Arestovich before the war said that from Belarus there will not be an advancement because it will end up pathetically. And now some critics are saying, hey, he said that. Well, I want to say that it happened, but it did finish in a sorrow way, right? So I predicted that. And they came from Ivankova, and then they had to split in different directions, and that's because of rivers and the system of canals and other things, and they basically could not advance any further. And that's where we got them with artillery. We started working on them really well. I'll put pictures after the war. It was amazing. I still remember people screaming, saying, hey, black smoke, we hit them, another black smoke, we got them. So artillery guys who were defending Kyiv, they had a shit ton of work to do. And me and the other guys in command were also coordinating requests from Kherson, Chernihiv, Sumy, other places, but Kyiv, that's my impression, that they've been just constantly hitting equipment. That's when we really started destroying them, because they were burning en masse. And I was wondering, how many units did we destroy? And I get an answer back, 40. I was like, no, impossible, because the usual attack is about 5 units maybe, and I get an answer back, no, we really counted. We took an effort to count. And then they started throwing more reserves in this direction, and we see another call, 200 units, 400 units, 300 units, an aggregation of 1,500 units, and I ask our artillery guys, do we have enough ammo? And they're shaking heads saying, we don't know. And at the same time, Russians were using their aviation pretty successfully, so they did destroy several of our artillery groups. So they were been advancing towards Zhytomyr highway, and on the clock it's from 12 to 9, and then they wanted to go down to south and cut us off from Odessa and other places. And then Kyiv would be, for the most part, surrounded. So that's where they went, to the western side. I'll speak about the eastern later. So they took this highway and wanted to use it to go into Kyiv. And I need to say one more thing. I'll probably be yelled at for it, but in Kyiv, the first 5 days, there was no defense. Seriously, there was like not a single concrete block anywhere. It was me and another servant of Ukrainian people pointing at people where to put them. So probably between third and fifth day we finally created some sort of defense around Kyiv. If they pushed a little harder at the beginning when they were going to Abalon and such, they would be fighting with us in the center of the city. We would not really have an opportunity to hold it. But they probably hit the first defenders and got some real bad experience from it, and they decided not to push it further. So they've been fighting for Zhytomyr highway and Borodyanka and Makarova, and that's our military. I'm not quite sure which all of them are involved. We can only point finger at one. But then they make a unique and smart move. They essentially throw two brigades, 14th and my 72nd, near Makarova to precede the enemy's advancement planned for the next day. So we have a group of Russian troops that was ready to advance, but today there are two battalion groups from our troops get in the middle of that Russian group and capture two towns in the middle. And they cannot, what it does, it basically demoralizes those troops. They cannot advance with that group behind. So they start fighting for these two towns, and of course they waste a lot of resources trying to, and there is no Ukrainian option in this case. And another thing we did a good kill box. What is that? That's a box where you basically lead them to, and then you hit them with artillery and aviation there. There was a good kill box near Makarov. We were kind of hurting them. They could not go to the left, they could not go to the right. Then they decided to stay en masse, 1,200 units together, and that's where we just unloaded all our artillery on them, destroying most of them, and that's why in that direction there was no advancement for a while. They tried to go to the White Church and got their asses handed to them. And that's how the fight over the fight for the western bank of Kiev was won. The supply lines was always the weakest part of the Red Army, and Russian army can never fight without the quantitative advantage. They can do things when you have 20 over 1, but they need to use it proper. They created so many, so much troops in the same spot that they couldn't really move around it. So the density of their columns was so bad that you could be shooting them and not even missing. And then the special forces and partisans started acting, and they were blowing more of them and destroying soldiers and troops, and blowing up bridges behind them and cutting them off. And then our guys were slowly surrounding them and going around them and destroying them after. And then Bucha and Irpin, from the military standpoint, is a dead end. It's like a tongue hanging over Kiev, and they got there, but there is no way to continue because the bridges are blown, and your elite force, you're there, but you cannot do anything. You cannot cross the river. There is nothing, no way to no option there. So they were pretty upset by actually getting there. And that's my emotional memory of how and what we're doing in the center of Kyiv. And another thing, I was also curious as a military person, I was curious if they would be able to capture Kharkiv. And in Kharkiv, they couldn't even go to the surrounding highway, the circular thing around it. You know, you want to say that some guys are better than the others, and in Kharkiv, it was a really grinder for Russian troops. So they had basically 50 troops and 2 lieutenants. On one side, they had that force and 33 Russian tanks roll out onto them, because even professional military would not be able to do much or be more demoralized than that. But you know, you cannot do much against 30 tanks running at you in speed. But these guys probably did not know that they cannot fight it, and they immediately destroyed 3 or 5 tanks, and they were just hiding there around the roads and burning those tanks, and they've never really done that before. And Russians were impressed with that, and they withdrew and never came again. And in other locations, yeah, Russians lost over half of their force trying to attack Kharkiv. Another direction was near Chernihiv, Sumy. At the beginning of war, I was sure for 101% that we'll have 4 Mariupols: Chernihiv, Sumy, Kharkiv, and Mariupol and Poltava. Just by the ratio of troops and assets, we would not have chance to hold these cities. And one of the legends says that we had no time to call on the reserves. No, that's not so. We actually had a chance to call the reserves and train them a bit and balance between other things. And we've done a lot of other activities that probably not many people will even know. Maybe after the war we'll disclose some. So I was about 105%, 101% ready that these cities will fall or we'll lose them, because you need a very different economy to be able to fight such a big army, to be able to protect all your cities on these thousands of kilometers front lines. Now, with everything that Chernihiv did awesome. Russians couldn't even enter it. With all the brilliant defense in Kharkiv. With the super impressive, grandiose defense of Akhtirka, who held off the Russian tanks, and they did not even realize where were they attacking, because Akhtirka, that's Gusar headquarters, Gusar Central. There are a lot of military traditions in that area. But everybody gets compliments, but Sumy is getting the real praise here, because Sumy had almost no Ukrainian troops there. It was bare minimum there. Even American army cannot equally. So later we got more troops there in that area, but not even to Sumy themselves, on the outskirts. And in Sumy there was territorial defense. So it was one of the officers, reserve officers, who opened self-defense, one of the self-defense facilities, and gave weapons to people. So it's territorial defense with AKs. And I'm sending messages between myself and their command. And one of the elite forces, and probably fourth, I think 90-somethings, and the fourth Russian troops, 2 tank divisions, elite tank divisions, attacked them. Chechens, they got to the chemical factory near Sumy and sent the ultimatum: do not shoot us, we're near a chemical facility, so surrender. And I was thinking that Sumy is going to be gone. I figured they probably will, I'll get notice tomorrow that this area is gone. So this territorial defense with machine guns and grenade launchers destroyed 2 Russian tank divisions. You can literally line up everybody from that initial resistance there and give a hero of Ukraine to every person, and maybe even give 3 to some of them. You know that hero of Ukraine can only be given once in lifetime. I think it should be repeated. I'm really fighting for it to be twice or thrice, because some people should get more medals than Brezhnev in Soviet Union did, just for their achievements. And I can tell a small story from that. I get a group of guys reaching out to me saying, we got a weapons cache, and the old captain, reserve captain, does not let us in. So I ask, hey, give me him on the phone. They give me the phone. They give him the phone. I'm telling him who I am. Do you know me? Yes, I do. So I request him, hey, on my authority, give them that much weapons. If they come back with results, give them more. So I was basically telling him, hey, I'm the representative of Central Command, and that's how I solved a lot of things at the beginning of this war. So they get weapons for their passports, and an hour and a half later they bring 8 captured Russian military intel. So they made a trap, they destroyed several vehicles, captured some troops, and they bring them to the captain. So after that they actually had love and understanding, and he was supporting them with everything they had. So, and they were really defending themselves. It was just territorial defense. So Sumy is unbelievable. If Sumy and Chernihiv fell, Kiev would not be able to hold, because, or at least would be in a much more difficult situation, because they would be cutting our roadways from all the sides, and it would not be a complete end of Kiev, but it would be an organized resistance. But it would be a really harder situation. So Sumy and Chernihiv essentially saved Kiev. So what Russian army showed to be? They became a very weak copy of Soviet army. Soviet army had a lot of strong sides to that. They could not develop the strong sides, but they enhanced the weak ones. So they could not create a real model matching the necessities of the current times. They created a weaker model of Soviet army, and out of those 30 airborne troop detachments, they lost 29 of them. Only one succeeded near Novaya Kakhovka, and they lost 60% of those people dead. The rest were captured or fled. And those are the best they had. There is no one left, really. They're gone. Those people take time. They take 5, 6, 10 years to prepare. And those are people who fought in Chechnya, in Central African Republic, and Syria. They're all gone. And then the other side of Russian army is, what is a centralized regime? I often get that. Why are you telling them they will fix it? No, they won't, because that's by design. What command of a battalion in Russia, he normally would have been able to, away from the places where they're being hit at, and rearrange them and create a mobile front line. So what is a lower division in the Russian army? It's a 100-people detachment, and its lieutenant barely has authority to hold people. So if it gets real hot, they would not be commendable. They will start crumbling. So the only person who can actually command them would be a commander of battalion, and they have to hold them very close to each other, next to battalion commanders, otherwise they lose their maneuverability, they lose the command line. So, in essence, they're keeping them close instead of spreading them around. So, with that being close, it was really easy target. And now people are saying that Russians learned after the first months of war, maybe a little bit. So now the column is not 40 miles, it's instead of that there'll be 4 columns of 10 miles. That's what they learned. So another example, there is one gas station up north, BDRSM gas station. We were laughing and calling it BDSM station. Me personally, 5 times I was part of that. There was a column entering there, we destroy them. Another column gets there, we destroy them, and that happened 5 times. So imagine you're a Russian commander and you are giving an order by high command, go to that place. That's where you check your equipment and continue advancing to Kiev. You come there and you see about 80, the carcasses of 80 pieces of equipment. I know, trees destroyed, equipment destroyed. It seems like the artillery is hitting that place. And they still come there and stay there. We cover them. We polish them into dust. The next group comes. They see the still smoldering vehicles and bodies, but they still come and stay there. And that's what Russian army does. And they do, I mean, you can admire that, I guess, because they were still standing in place or trying to advance regardless. It's almost like Strugatsky sci-fi writers about the zombie towers, that following the troops that are basically zombifying them, and the guys were advancing despite of all the firepower thrown at them.
И вот они, значит, за счет этой
And
централизации, за счет
because of that Russian might, they actually blocked their own supply routes. So when people were screaming, oh, there is a column of 62 miles advancing onto Ukraine, they forgot that in order for that column to be worthy, it also needs a supply line, and it will never reach them if they're so big. Ukrainian army is strong in improvising. If we're getting hit somewhere, next time we're not there. So the field commander will figure out where to move their detachment, and they, not all of them, but most of them will do it right and pick the better position. We are decentralized, and we are encouraging the improvisation. This is like national archetypes. Russian Zhukov and Petrov, hey, follow the command, do not move left or right. And Ukrainian is more like a Cossack style, very fluid, very adaptive. Also, we'll see how it changes when we go into offensive, because one thing is when we're defending, that's easier. You're basically hiding in the bushes and using the territory and your knowledge of it to fight. So we'll see what happens when the tables are turned. Alexei, if you have a few more minutes, yes, I do. I want to ask you about Donbass and the East. There are several articles in well-known publications like Politico, and there is knowledge that Russia is hitting our important infrastructure pieces, and it may be problematic for Ukraine. British at the same time are saying that despite all the efforts, Russian army had not advanced further, same near Izum. So in your understanding, in broad brushstrokes, Donbass and that wider picture. So the bigger picture is pretty understandable. From Kharkiv to Mariupol, there's I think it's or half. It's like 45,000 on that side. Another 45 on Zaporozhye and Kherson in the south. So we'll see where they drop the rest, but for now that's how it's split. And I've said that before, and wake me up in 100 years and I'll tell you the same thing, that Russian army fights with double pincers. And they learned it with you. What does it mean? It's a double pincer. They create a small pincer and then there is a bigger one outside it. So they had a small one from Izum to Volnovakha and the big ones from Pavlograd, Guляйполе, and from Izum, the north, to the border of Dnipropetrovsk, to capture everybody, and so nobody can go to the west. So following their heroic battle fight, they basically diminished that pincer 5 times, and now their culmination would be surround Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, not much happening in the south, and maybe also cut Popasna, Rubezhny, and Severodonetsk out. How do they fight? They made their conclusions, how some tongues are saying they're learning and they're fighting more dangerously. No, not really. They're fighting the same way. The only thing they learned is that the column is not 40 miles, it's 4 times 10 miles, because that's how they fight. It's by design, and it seems like a genetic imprint. They cannot do anything else different. So artillery, they're concentrating artillery on our troops, but it's shooting from afar because it's afraid to be hit, so they're not too accurate. Also, they're using jet and aviation troops, but they're also not daring to cross the border, to come to the front line too close, because for the fear of being shot. So they're attacking, but they're not too precise. And frankly, that whole attempt to get that area is stupid from the very beginning, because that ratio 1 to 3, 1 to 2 is silly. You cannot capture this area with those troops. You need like 1 to 6 maybe. So what they do, they concentrate fire, they barrage air, artillery in the same positions, and then eventually when Ukraine troops retreat and everything is destroyed there, they move a little bit further and repeat it again. And you've been telling, I was saying also that it'll be 2-3 weeks after they start the invasion, after they start the operation, and they've been sorta trying to start it, but they just started it recently, and they also needed to aggregate some of the troops. And instead of accumulating the big power and then throwing it all, they were pushed by political will, and they were basically aggregating a little bit and sending it in, getting a little more and sending it in. That's one of the biggest military mistakes. And near Marinska, they couldn't even cross 800 meters, 800 yards on the field. It's funny. It's sad but funny. A lot of dead force in that area, and they could not continue. They gathered 25,000 troops in the north near Izum, and they're trying to continue going down and also go from Avdiivka in the front and create a small encirclement. Is there a risk to do that? Not at this point. Of course, we are losing troops at this area, and we're slowly retreating, and they're taking, recently they've taken 2 villages, and you need to understand what the village is in that area. It's really when everything is destroyed down to the basement, so it's very nominal, and they're presenting it as Ukrainian troops have withdrawn and we attacked. In reality, we're just slowly grinding them down. And we also destroyed about 8 aviation detachments over that area. Again, the smaller version, the Russian version, Soviet would have twice that personnel, but yeah, we've been shooting them down consistently. So, since the 4th of April to 26th, for over 25 kilometers. This is about nothing. This is amazing. So, reasonable Russian commanders probably did raise their voice and said, this is silly. You're throwing the last of your operative reserve, almost. They get probably another 20,000 in Belgorod region. And if you need to eventually defend what you captured, and Ukraine will turn the tables and will start attacking, will break, you do need troops to defend this line. And for the whole line of over 1,000 kilometers, they have 90,000. And there is no logistical support, the commanders of tank detachments did not suicide themselves for nothing, because some of them were ordered to bring that much equipment, and when he went and checked what he has, there was really nothing, so the guy suicided himself. They literally have no army for long-term fighting. They were planning their war for 3 to 5 days, like Georgia, and Georgia taught them bad. They figured that they are not battle-ready in Georgia. It's actually a small country, but they did kick ass. That's why Russians stopped the war in Georgia. On one hand, they could not advance because they were afraid of the city fight in Georgia. Georgian forces went to partisan fighting mode pretty quickly, so they basically stopped without going to Tbilisi, and they negotiated it out. And Americans also pressed on Georgians to go to the negotiation table, so it was different. Also, speaking of reserves, they have some really old equipment that they need to get out, and most of them don't even work. And then, speaking of the human reserves, our situation is way better. They really lack. They have a short-term reserve system, but it's maybe 60,000 tops. So the last divisions they were throwing in here from the Pacific, they were putting people without a military education, military degree to command troops. That tells you how bad their situation is. And that's the quality, and when they call the DNR, LNR people, the conscribed people, and without training, throw them in the grinder, out of 100, there may be 5 or 6 left in a few days, and the rest have no limbs if they are alive. So that's the quality of the troops they have. And right now they're really trying to push further on Lugansk and Donetsk and as much as they can in the south, to later use negotiations or something to confirm that capture, because we need that to sell to the internal audience, to tell them that, hey, that was our goal and we achieved it. Did you notice that in every 10 days they changed the goals of the war? So I did not expect their idiocy in the south. Why do you think it's idiotic? Well, because it's idiotic. They start attacking us on 9 different directions. That's pure idiocy. What if you hit with open palm instead of a fist? That's what they did. So they need to change and adapt after, because they were losing. The Kyiv transfer. Troops transfer and withdrawal was important because they suffered defeat near Kyiv and Sumy, and they then withdrew that and threw to the east. And then the troops who were once destroyed and damaged near Kyiv, they decided to use to advance and throw them in the grider on the east, where we have more equipped positions, where we have actually some armor to fight them back. And then that was not enough. They're also trying to do the south. So just the moment when I was even laughing, because when they seem to have resolved some things, they repeat their mistake. Do you know why they put Dvornikov as a general over that? Because that's one of them who can raise their troops into attack when the troops don't want to. That's what he was famous for in Syria. So imagine, they somehow kicked us out of Lugansk and Donetsk. They got to the borders. Just no. We won it on the 4th of March this year. Why the 4th of March? On the 12th day of conflict. Why do you say so? Because that's when the Russian Federation Council refused to call for mass conscription. Basically, that's when they recorded the video, and Putin joined that and said that there'll be no mass conscription. And that's their public agreement with Russian citizens, that one thing is eating and drinking and watching TV about the war happening somewhere, but they don't want to go and fight themselves. So, but even that probably will not happen, because our guys are still holding. Knock on wood, but I was expecting it to be much worse. I thought that Russian group with that concentration of power will push through, and they'll probably be 50-50, in some places will push and other places they will. But it seems like it's only their part is really exhausting themselves. For the most part, it's not easy for our troops too. It's a meat grinder, but if you look at the battlefield, but if you look at the operative level, if you advance for 2 kilometers over 7 days, and only because your enemy withdrew from that part, because it's impossible to defend, there's nothing left there, this is a really stupid success. And they will lose a lot of their resources in this manner, and then they'll stall at some point. And in the south, they cannot proceed too far because they only have 2 ways to supply. And it's impossible to do that too, because you cannot supply through a bottleneck to the group of troops that are supposed to capture much wider territory. And regardless, they still pushed their troops forward, and we hit them 3 generals and a few command outposts and more ammo. So yeah, they're kind of losing there. Another one who can get the hero of Ukraine is the Air Force of Ukraine. I think because the best specialists of the world gave our Air Force maybe 3 hours of existence. They were saying that yes, Ukraine is strong on the ground, we believe that, but aviation, no, they'll be gone in the first few hours of the war. Russia will destroy them almost immediately. On day 61, our aviation did a lot of aviation hits on the good targets, good fat targets, and killed a couple generals. So everybody in there can get a hero of Ukraine, from the very lowest rank to the highest rank, and maybe give 3 stars to the commander, because to be that effective and to sustain the fighting capability, it's really awesome. As a military man, I'm almost at awe looking at the way they maneuver. So my prognosis, they looking around in 2 to 3 weeks, the usual. And by the way, British Intel is also supporting you. I think they're quoting me. They are grinding to a halt, and we're starting to raise each other's potentials. First, they'll be trying to prepare the youngsters, the draft, to join the war. They'll be somewhere on the border of Kherson and Nikolaevsky region, and the zone on the east of United operation. And in Kharkiv, we're actually advancing a bit, and they're getting concerned because we can cut the tail of all that Izium group if we're successful. And so that everything comes to the halt, and it goes to positional fighting, and then 2 sides are starting to compete with each other who gets more reserves faster. So Russia will be trying to get a bit more troops and bring whatever equipment they can find working. And on the other side will be armed by the West. So who will be faster? With all the meetings with the West, I keep saying that our main thing, the war is not about the quantities, it's about rhythms. So if they repeat the group, if we start to do it faster, we can actually eventually go into offensive at the end of May, beginning of June, and that'll be positional fighting before that. It will be fighting with air and artillery, and special forces will be crossing the front line and cutting some important officers on both sides. So there is Mariupol that I left it to the end. It's a very tragic situation, very difficult, because Azovstal, it's at least 1,000 civilians in there, women, elderly and kids. Their 3-ton bombs are being dropped on their heads, and Putin is lying as usual. When he said they'll cease fire, they intensified. We offered to withdraw people, Turks offered to evacuate people. The whole international community tried to do that, from the heads of all the churches, known denominations in the world. And Putin is a sadist. When everybody is asking him to do something, he likes to make it hurt more. But we'll see. I hope at some point we'll provide for the evacuation of the defenders, and at least we're doing everything possible and impossible. Irina Vereshchuk, our Vice Prime Minister, she is doing inhuman efforts for the last 2 months. I'm looking at her with a very different eyes now. I actually re-evaluated my impression of many of the cabinet people. Many of them are super commanders. The way they were lifting, like some of the economy guys are lifting the barriers on the economy, on the border, on the trade. But Miss Irina is a super lady, everything evacuated. It's her personal care. If you should see her fighting with Russian side on the phone for every refugee, every group. She's been fighting for house pets, everything that we can and want to, our people need to evacuate. She's doing everything possible. So I still have a hope that we will be able to evacuate those people alive. There's no way to save it as a city. It's been destroyed, but we're trying to, I hope we'll save at least the fighters. It's not an easy situation, and, you know, one should not say that, but we could have had 5 Mariupols. So I know this is a weak boon for friends and relatives. I actually have a godson who is 19 years old, who is fighting there, and a good friend of mine. So I'm also hurting. Everybody who is in our cabinet has some friends or relatives in Mariupol. Seriously. You cannot forget about, you know, whom? Grandma, who is your relative, or a cousin who is fighting there. So that's the situation. And I think Russia is facing a military defeat here in Ukraine. They need to suffer severe military defeat here. Thank you, Olexiy. I understand how busy you are. Glad to have met with you and had a chance to talk to you. Thank you.